I have to admit, I'm more nervous about this rumination than I have been in one in a long time. See, I kind of want to start talking about this right off the bat. Once upon a time, I had a restriction on ruminations. That restriction has since been lifted. In fact, basically all restrictions have been lifted from rumination requests. The only two things that are required are one, you have to be a patron to request a rumination, and two, it has to be not on the forbidden list. And the forbidden list is a very duh thing. If you ask me to ruminate on some hentai game, I'm going to say no. It's very, very logical, very sense making. So, in other words, in every way that matters, there's not really any actual limitations on rumination requests. Once upon a time, I had the rule that it had to be something that I liked, and it had to be something that I knew. It had to be something that I felt I could speak with authority. Like I felt like I actually could talk about it at length. Like if a friend of mine walked up and said, "Hey, what do you think about such and such?" I could just engage in conversation with them about that. And that rule has been lifted, which leads us to today, The Legend of Dragoon. Now I've played this game before, back in like 2002, I want to say, or something like that. It's been quite a long time, is what I'm trying to say. So this was my second playthrough ever of this game. And I have to admit, I don't really feel like I can speak with authority on this matter. Add that to the fact that this is actually a fairly popular game, something of a cult classic, and a game that a lot of people have been requesting, some kind of sequel or continuation or even a proper remake of. And so I find myself with the unenviable task of sitting here talking to you guys about something that is popular that I don't know that well. And that leads me to one of the things, and I know this is a weird thing to talk about to start, but one of the things I've always tried to adhere to with regards to my show, positivity is one thing, trying to be entertaining is a second thing, trying to elicit thought, to engage into, thinking is the third thing. But also, I don't like to just get up here and ramble. I know you're going to argue with me and you're going to be like, what? No, you're terrible. And I'm sure my detractors will say whatever they wish to as well. But from my perspective, when I prepare every single one of these ruminations for the show or for the main events on Friday, I sit down and the very first question I think to myself is, do I have anything worth saying? Is there anything I feel like I can add to the discussion of this? Anybody who's been following me for a while remembers one of my biggest concerns with several of my previous ruminations, notably the Metal Gear Solid series, was I wasn't sure I had anything new to add to the pile. That the Metal Gear Solid series had already been discussed at such length and for so long that I wasn't sure I was adding anything to the pile. Now, that was a well received series, so woo, but it doesn't change the nervousness, especially with something I don't know that well, like a game I've only played twice. Now, I did kind of immerse myself into this game quite a bit, but I only have a single page of notes. Now, so I'm really hopeful that this will be an interesting episode, even though this will probably be short, and I do apologize. Do keep in mind that part of this, this whole having something worth saying thing, it's about not having any padding. I mean, you guys, if you've seen any of my stuff, you know that I am very against padding in any form of entertainment, any form of media. And in this case, this is why my ruminations, why all of my videos really don't really have a set, this is how long this video is going to be. I don't have a minimum, and I don't have a maximum. I talk until I feel I have said everything I need to say, or until I've said everything that I haven't forgotten, and then later I'll release a second video to talk about what I forgot about, because I'm an idiot. you know. But yeah, so here's Legend of Dragoon. Now, first of all, this actually sold pretty well in the United States, and basically nowhere else, which I find fascinating for a number of reasons. This was a game that was made unusually for the time. Let me go ahead and reiterate something I said earlier really quick. The idea that this game could use a proper remake. Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of things that could use touching up, and I think that this game could really benefit from a proper remake more than most other PS1 era RPGs could, in my frank opinion. A lot of other RPGs either have aged better or don't have as much difficulty displaying the quality that's there. Another thing I want to comment on is the fact that this game, so I mentioned it was unusual in its construction. So this game actually took about 3 years to make. as an aside. Isn't that a weird historical note? Once upon a time, only about 15 or so years ago, it was considered unusual for a game to take as long as 3 years to make. Think about that for a moment. Anyways, so they took 3 years making this game, and they had a huge team. They keep quoting this number of 100 people. The point to be relevant there, though, is it wasn't 100 people always working on this game for 3 years. Basically, people would be cycled in and out of the development team. It's probably one of the reasons why the game approaches storytelling with a chapter-based format. Chapter 1 feels like its own little contained story. Like you could release that as a game, and then Legend of Dragoon 2 would be Chapter 2, and so forth and so on. Although Chapter 4 would probably be best amended to Chapter 3. But you get the point. And I feel a lot of the reason that storytelling style exists is because of the fact that they had this team of people constantly cycling in and out, including several of the people who worked on Ico. Team Ico did some work for this game. Probably helps to explain some of the quality that's on display, like I mentioned. The next thing I'm going to talk about, now that I've said praise of this game, uh, I have a feeling I'm going to be tarred and feathered over this one. It is worth noting I consulted one other friend of mine who's actually played it. I've only known one other person personally who's actually played this game, and I talked with him about it. And he and I both agreed that this is a textbook JRPG. We hammered around or trying to figure out a better word for that for a while, because the problem was, if you call it a typical JRPG, that usually means a bad thing. If you call it a cliched JRPG or a basic JRPG or whatever, most other words have a negative connotation to it, which I'm trying to avoid. Textbook, I think, suits the situation much better. This pretty much hits it, the way he phrased it was, he said it hits all the check boxes. If you had a list, these are the things that define a JRPG. Legend of Dragoon goes down the list and checks every single one of them. And that is basically true. It is a textbook example of a JRPG. It is like this is what a JRPG is and should be. It may not be of the highest quality. It is not the worst. It's not the best in gameplay. It's not the best in story. But it is a definitive JRPG. It's like the thing that all other JRPGs could be measured against to see if they actually qualify for that type of presentation, for that type of genre. And it reminds me very much of some of the modern Tales of games, actually. And speaking of which, just as a quick aside, first of all, you can buy Legend of Dragoon now on the PSN. However, it has some game-breaking bugs that don't actually work properly, so just a bit of a warning on that. I ran into a couple of those myself, actually. Second of all, though, I've heard many, many people say that they really want Legend of Dragoon 2, or a continuation of it. And I'm with you. I get the desire. That's awesome. It would be great if we got a continuation of this game. But in the meantime, let me go ahead and recommend to those of you who haven't already done this to go ahead and look at the Tales of series. The Tales of series are also very textbook JRPGs that have a high standard of quality. That you can clearly see some of that quality on display. Most notably the ones from like GameCube onwards. The PS3 stuff is it's all good stuff. I recommend it personally. Now, I could go down the list and enumerate what I mean by the JRPG thing. I don't think I'm going to, especially since there's no real need to go into that here. I think the reason I'm hammering this point in so much, though, is I think that's part of the appeal of the game. It came out pretty much during the golden era of the PS1 JRPGs, when we had Star Ocean 2, and we had Final Fantasy 7, and we had Xenogears, and we had Chrono Cross, and we had Suikoden. All these games came out, and that's just a sampling of them. And this game came out, and I know several people were looking at this like, I know one person in the past, I haven't talked to him in years, but back in the day, he was like, well, I've never really gotten into the Final Fantasy series. He tried to play FF3, aka 6, on the SNES, and he just couldn't do it. And he wanted to see what all the fuss is about, and so he ended up picking up Legend of Dragoon, and it basically sold him on the genre. And then he started picking up some of the other ones from the PS1 era and ended up liking those. So it's kind of a unique thing in that it's a bit of a gateway to JRPGs as well. It does have its issues. I really don't like the voice acting. at all. I admit the combat was a bit off because it's like a very weird sidestep from the Mario RPG format, where you have to actually interact with it in addition to active turn based, which I like actually. But in this case, it's much more QTEs. It's much more okay. Do the attack and then hit the button, hit the button, hit the button. It feels much more QTE than active turn based. Not that I'm complaining about that per se, but it did get a little old after a while going through it, especially on some of the boss fights, which just have a stupid amount of health. I also find it funny how the Dragoon forms, after a while, just kind of stopped being useful, at least in my estimation, based on the way I was playing. Additions being a much, much better way to actually bring stuff down. But the thing I want to mention, my only real complaint about the gameplay is the exact same complaint I have about most older RPGs, especially JRPGs. The encounter rate. Now, I know you can put on the thing to make random encounters go away. And I know that there's always an indicator. It's not actually random encounters in the traditional sense of the word. It's like every so many feet an encounter happens. But it felt like that encounter rate was through the roof. And it did make the game drag on more than it really should have, in my opinion. I feel that if they had reduced the encounter rate substantially, boosted the amount of gain you get, or reduced the amount required to level and gain SP and whatnot, to balance that out, I think that would have made the game move much more smoothly and help some of the pacing issues. Because at several points in the game, at least me personally, I actually felt like I was just crawling my way to the next cutscene. Gosh darn it, I just need to reach the city, maybe that's just me, but that is my opinion on it. That's about all I have to say about the gameplay side of things. So, the number 108 is repeated several times throughout this one, which is funny, because I just talked about Suikoden 2 with the 108. I'm sure, for the same reason I thought there, that the 108 is a reference to the heavenly and earthly concept, as mentioned previously. But the 108 thing is a very strong motif. Every 108 years, the child is born. There are 108 total species birthed from the tree. There are 108 repetitions of this cycle. This being the 108th repetition of the cycle, that kind of a thing. I do have to say one other thing. I get that it's part of the point, and I'll talk about this in a moment. But I cannot help but I have to admit, when I first heard about the 11,000 year thing, I just rolled my eyes. I've said this before, and I've said this again. So many writers do not have an understanding or a comprehension of scope or scale. 11,000 years is an absolutely psychotically, insanely huge amount of time. In fact, I did the math. It is actually 11,574 years. Is how long ago the Dragon War happened. So there was time before that too. And of course, in reference to those of you who were with me with the WoW lore run, every time I was going through, I kept thinking 11,000 years. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that whole thing, because one of the things that's mentioned and emphasized throughout the work is that Soa's motivation was to create deliberate stagnation. The idea that the world basically didn't change or move for 11 millennia is actually a plot point. It is something that Soa wanted. This I find interesting. I actually very recently was talking with a viewer, awesome guy, who I will leave nameless just because I don't know if he wants to be talked about, but he was talking about a story idea he was writing where one of the main themes of the story was how to deal with universal stagnation. And in this case, I was reminded of that excessively when I was going through this game. So in this case, in this particular game, the way that Soa intended to deal with stagnation is to encourage stagnation to the point where everything just kind of stays it is forever, and then once everything is nice and bland and blah, wiping everything out and starting over. I gotta be honest, that doesn't actually make sense to me. It sounds a little bit more, if I was to speculate on it, that Soa's just a volcano. Let me explain what I mean by that. In other words, I don't think Soa is evil in the traditional sense of the word, but I think it, or he or she or whatever, has a total lack of empathy, caring, or otherwise relevance in its mind for life, for individuals, for people and cultures and children and society and fish and frogs, doesn't care. All it cares about is the overall pattern. And thus the idea that this cycle, I found myself wondering how many times this has been repeated, Reaper style, if you will, from Mass Effect, before the party members of this particular game, of this particular cycle, decided to try and stop it. Because the implication is there that this is part of the point. All right, make something new! And it all just sort of settles. And once it's all settled, make something new! Except, of course, the make something new part happens at the expense of the old, with the actual deliberate destruction of that stagnation. Thus, literally destroying stagnation. I'm not sure what I think about that. I'm not sure I can really agree with that. I do find it absolutely fascinating that for the first chunk of the game, for a fairly decent chunk of the game, there's a lot of emphasis on destiny. And I have to admit, that made me groan. I know. I myself have spoken against, automatic negativity towards a concept because of fatigue, but I am not super interested in the fated hero concept. I know it can be done well. I myself have pointed out times where it can be done well. But the fact that it was like, oh my God, all this is destined to happen, and we are destined to follow in the footsteps of our father, who's actually also 11,000 years old, only technically. Unlike Rose, excuse me. He didn't actually live through all that. But, destined. But the game pulled one on me. Because after a little bit, after we get past the whole this is all part of destiny thing, it became much, much more clear that destiny was for them to all die. And everything I just mentioned, the annihilation of life as we know it, and life in general, in order to create something new. And they rebelled against that, which is logical. But the thing and it kind of twisted it, because at that point it was like, screw destiny. That's basically the primary theme of the entire work. Screw destiny. Because destiny is what was laid down by Soa and his frickin' tree, and we're not in agreement with that. I do find it fascinating that in this work, the main distinction between the main villain, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, the main distinction between the main villain and the main characters is the fact that the main villain actually believes in destiny and believes in the fate of the world and what should happen, at least by the end of the game. Whereas the main characters are much more, no, we're going to try and do our own thing. A very weird form of fatalism versus determinism, if you will. And I find that to be an interesting contrast in philosophies between the two parties. I also... one thing I also want to comment that I find amusing is the idea that's implied several times, Rose herself says this actually, that the humans lean towards peaceful nature. Like it is the human's nature to actually be peaceful creatures. And that there really have been 11,000 years of peace since the Dragon War. That I find fascinating. And at first I didn't believe it. I figured it was just another example of unreliable narration, because there are several examples of that in this game, which are very well done. I love the Wingley reveal about the wings, So I thought that was just another example of that, until I started thinking about it and started really analyzing the plot. It actually makes perfect sense. The humans lean towards peaceful cooperation, and it's not until external factors start to move in. This is, in many ways, basically the exact opposite of Suikoden, the game I just freaking looked at, or will look at next week. From my perspective, I already did it. I'm pretty sure Suikoden's supposed to happen before this one. I'm not sure where it is on the schedule. Whatever. Point being, in Suikoden, there are people who that whole setting is a setting of war. People will fight each other for basically no reason over territory and vengeance and bloodshed and just God knows what else. In here, war has to be precipitated by an external force, and all of that is being pushed by like 3 different conspiracy groups who are 11,000 years old, who are all trying to move things towards their own ends. And I find that fascinating. The idea of the idea is brought forth, is stagnation necessarily a bad thing? Because think about it for a moment. If there was a world in which there was no pain, in which there was peace, in which people truly tolerated and understood and loved each other, would that not lead towards a state of such stagnation? Now, of course, I'm not saying whether it is bad or good. I try very hard to keep my opinions out of these kind of things. However, I do posit the question to you. Do you think that this is acceptable? Because the implication is there that that's exactly what's going to happen after the end of the game. With them removed, with the external powers removed, with Soa's plan screwed, and all of the Dragoons no longer having a need for doing anything, that everything's going to settle right back down again, and we're just going to have this peaceful society forever from now on. What do you think? Now, the main villain, is... so it makes sense to me that he bought into this philosophy of Soa, because he was already an uncaring bastard. Even way back when he was actually the ruler of the Winglies, he actually posited the idea that the lesser races literally did not deserve to exist, that they literally functionally had no purpose in existing, and it was only by their benevolence that they could be allowed to have some purpose in being slaves at best, and actually wiped out at worst. And that implies a tremendous lack of caring, a very cold fish, very calculus, very empty, devoid, sociopathic sort of a personality to me. And it makes sense that that kind of personality, when confronted with the idea of all life should be wiped clean and we start anew, would say, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So, of course, it's pretty likely, at least based on my interpretation, that that's not how he started. That originally he was basically just after more power, and over time he just kind of shifted in that direction. After all, he didn't spend 11,000 years inside Dart's father, and then, of course, was released and all sorts of other stuff like that. Speaking of him, Zeeg. God, I'm terrible with pronunciations. He reminds me... I only really have one tiny thing to say about him. He reminds me a lot of the Black Knight in Seiken Densetsu 3. And in many ways, he feels like a pawn of circumstances. The idea that there's so little he actually has control over his own circumstance. Honestly, from everything we see, really, we only actually see him being himself basically once. I mean, we see it a few other times, but really the only time I really felt like we were actually seeing the person, Zeeg, was at the end, during the ending cinematic, when he and Rose made their dramatic charge against From. I'm going to start calling him that. I like that name better. From. And all we see from him is someone who basically has there's not much to talk about. I mean, I hate to say that, but I just don't have much to say about his personality, because we didn't really see that much on camera. Now, Lloyd, I have a little more to talk about. Lloyd, I feel like the game wanted to make Lloyd out to a well-intentioned extremist, but from my personal opinion, I know I said I wouldn't give my opinion, but screw you, I'm giving it here. From my personal opinion and the way the game is presented and everything he did, I think Lloyd doesn't really get a pass. I feel like, Lord knows that my own viewers yell at me for being accepting of redemption too easily in certain cases, Kerrigan from StarCraft being a big example. But, and Arthas, I don't know why I'm listing Blizzard games, but Arthas over in Warcraft. So, you're probably going to look at me weird, because I feel like he doesn't really deserve his redemption in this one. He mentions how he was trying, his motive was to create this new paradise, this new perfect world where everything would be amazing for everyone. Now, his motives in doing so for that make sense. Remember, the Winglies are basically screwed as of the modern age. Humans are doing fine, but Winglies are still hated to this day, still have a bias against humans, still, they no longer have any kind of height of anything. They live in the frickin' forest instead of in cities in the sky. But more to the point, they do not have a good life. And the idea of someone who is from that, in sort of a post-World War I Germany kind of a situation, if you will, except elongated from a few years to 11 frickin' millennia, makes sense. And that he would want a better world, for everyone. I mean, the Gigantos is another example of a race that probably could use a little bit of a better life, right? And Lord knows the humans tend to be a little anti-everything else. Yeah. Excuse me. But I bring this up because, for me, I find myself wondering if what kind of person he was before he was deceived. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, I think he is more of a neutral evil kind of a character. He may have good intentions, but he has absolutely no problem hurting someone else to benefit himself. That's my take on his character. And I also think he has a little bit of delusional romanticism, something I myself am guilty of about many things. Palpatine. Um, but I feel like he absolutely romanticizes the ideal and the ideas of the Winglies and the old kingdoms and the power and the new world, which will be this wonderful paradise and all that stuff, far more than he probably should. And I think that taints his judgment considerably. But I do not think he is a good person. I don't think he is redeemed. I think it's simply more of the fact that he realizes that what he was fighting for was wrong, and therefore decides to join the heroes for his own purposes, that he himself has his own interests in mind still. Again, that neutral evil perspective. That's just my take on him. I kind of have a similar thought about Dole, actually. Emperor Dole. So Emperor Dole, well, actually, that's not true. See, I think Emperor Dole is a person who feels trapped by obligation. The idea that he, first of all, we know he's being manipulated by external forces, so that doesn't help anything. But the fact that he killed Carlo, just to name one example, that actually makes a lot of sense to me, because what we learn is that Carlo was being basically a puppet ruler, being controlled by the ministry. And that is the kind of thing that's just going to lead to bad stuff within the kingdom. And Dole believed that the only way to fix that was to frickin' kill him. So again, what I'm trying to say here is I don't think Dole's a good guy. I don't think he is redeemed, as the game kind of tries to present him. I do think he is someone who is a bad person, someone who is evil in some extent or another, but a much more gray variant of evil. In fact, in my personal opinion, Lloyd and Dole are probably the best characters in this game overall. I really like their presentation, and I really like the layers beneath them. So his trying to turn things into this new industrial era, this new unified kingdom, what I feel like is that he felt his kingdom, his people, needed a strong warrior king, and Carlo was a puppet, and he was a softie. He was an Anduin. He's the kind of person who would actually be a better peacetime king. And so he tried to force himself to be a warrior king. And you know how a kid will act in a certain way when they're trying to act cool, and they have their own particular mindset of what cool is, so they come off as just kind of a dope. That's kind of what I'm thinking here, except on a more severe, serious, and with more consequences scale. I think he was trying to portray what he believed a warrior king should be. And it's so obvious to me, because the reason I believe this so strongly is because he drops the facade completely when you finally get to that final confrontation with him, and he's just saying, yeah, okay, I'm not a warrior king, I can't do this. I have no idea what I'm doing, guys. So I don't really have much to say about most of the main characters. I was affected by Lavitz. That one did hit me. Albert was a very logical second step for that one. I feel for Rose. That's got to be terrible. Not just living that long, but having to kill a child every 108 years, and everyone around them, and knowing that you basically have no choice but to do it, and knowing that you're going to be doing this forever because there was no hope for the cycle to end until, the actual events of the game happened at the 108th iteration. Yeah, that's basically one of those fates worse than death. That's the kind of thing that Hades would look at and be like, damn, we need to cut her a break. I feel for Rose, is what I'm trying to say. Dart, I have nothing to say about Dart. He is in many ways your archetypal JRPG hero. Again, the textbook thing I mentioned earlier. I do want to talk about one theory I have. So first of all, the Dragoons in many ways reminded me, and maybe this is because I just recently played through it, of the Bayonetta 2 thing. In other words, the Umbra Witches and the Lumen Sages only having all the power that they have, all the skill, all the superhuman abilities, because of the bonds that they made with either the Inferno demons or the Paradiso angels. In other words, the Dragoons actually being people who have merged with the dragon spirits, and that's what gives them power. Otherwise, they're basically fairly normal people. Now, I have that perspective in lore, because I've already actually mentioned in gameplay, I actually felt like the Dragoon forms were actually not that useful. But in lore, I always got the perspective that that's the idea being trying to pushed across here. And we do know in lore a Dragoon is damned powerful. The kind of thing that could literally take out a city. Never mind the great legend of the Black Monster. I mean, that started up for a reason, after all. So I do find that interesting, especially since it's implied that one of the points is dragons aren't fully sentient and sapient. They just have a great deal of pride and a degree of intelligence, like intelligent animals, and that they do choose their hosts. So you're kind of at the whims of the dragon spirit and whether or not it will merge with you and allow you to utilize it or not. But also, so take all of that power without the real mind, will, if you will, pushing it, combine it with the mind and will of a human, and you have what I believe, and I've seen several other people talk about this too, to be the strongest type of thing that exists in the setting. I mean, that makes sense. It is called Legend of Dragoon, after all, and the main characters being dragoons, and several of the main villains being dragoons as well. It's logical. It makes sense to me. I do also find one thing interesting that I believe. So we see there's a dragon spirit of each of the major essences. I forget all of them off the top of my head. You know, darkness and divinity and fire and ice and water, all that fun stuff, right? But we see other dragons throughout the course of the thing, and there's this one comment about the mountain of the mortal dragon, and that kind of got me thinking. And I started thinking, what if there's basically two types of dragons in this setting? Dragon beasts, mortal dragons, if you will, who do not actually, who are basically the species of dragons, and then amongst the species of dragons there were the 8 avatars. I think it's 8 avatars of one of the given elements, if you will, of this particular setting. And those are the ones that actually form the dragon spirits and can then be gifted to someone to form a dragoon. I do also think it's interesting that the Winglies back in the day had their own particular version of this with the 108th species. um, I honestly don't think I really have much else to say. I'm really sorry. Um, as I'm just kind of searching my mind through the playthrough, it was a fun game. I recommend any of you out there who enjoy it to replay it sometime soon. And like I said, try out the Tales of series. It's in many ways analogous. I I have to admit that I did like the primary theme of this game. You know, screw destiny. I'm being one of those determinist kind of people who prefers to think that I have the ability to decide rather than having to be plucked along by fate's strings. And that again being pretty much the primary theme of the entire work kind of resonated with me. But ultimately, I think that textbook comment is the one that's really going to resonate with me most. This, if someone asks me what is a JRPG in the future, I'm gonna point to this game and say Legend of Dragoon. That is a JRPG. That is all you need to know about the JRPG concept. They may morph around it and change, you know, the specifics, but at the core of what a JRPG is, it's always going to be this game. And I think that's cool. I think it's awesome. And I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you guys next time.